The Draconis Imperium had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time, no one had dared to challenge them. No one had been foolish enough to steal from them, and no one had ever made them feel fear until the day the Hatchlings vanished. The fortress world of Pirith was the most sacred place in the entire empire, and at its heart stood the Great Hatchery, a massive dome of crystal and ancient stone where the future leaders of dragonkind took their first breaths, where eggs containing admirals and governors and warriors rested under the watchful eyes of 1,000 guards, where security systems older than most civilizations hummed with deadly power. 17 hatchlings disappeared from this place without a single alarm sounding, and without a single guard seeing anything strange, and without leaving behind even a trace of how it had been. Dunhigh Commander Vethra received the news while reviewing fleet formations in orbit above Pirith, and for a long moment she simply stared at the report as if the words might change if she looked at them long enough, but they did not change, and the reality of what had happened slowly settled into her ancient bones like she had fought in wars that lasted centuries, and she had burned worlds that dared to resist the Imperium, and she had never once felt the cold grip of helplessness that now wrapped around her hearts. But this was different because this was not an attack on soldiers or ships or territory. This was an attack on children, on the future itself. The Imperium did not respond to this crime with careful investigation or patient diplomacy, because dragons were not patient creatures, and they did not forgive, and they certainly did not forget. So instead, they responded with rage that shook the foundations of a dozen worlds, and Bastard Crixthanar was chosen to lead the investigation, and everyone who knew him understood why, because he was old and scarred, and his scales had faded from proud crimson to iron gray, and he had served the Imperium for so long that he remembered when humans were still crawling around on a single blue planet playing with sharp sticks and fire. He had seen species rise and fall like waves against the shore, and he had learned that most problems could be solved with sufficient application of flame and force, and he fully intended to solve this problem the same way his fleet arrived at the edge of human space 3 days after leaving Pirith, and it was not a small fleet, because Crixthanar believed in making statements that could not be misunderstood. 12 dreadnoughts hung in the void like metal mountains, and their weapons glowed with the promise of destruction, and their message was very clear. The humans had joined galactic civilization only 2 centuries ago, and in that time they had proven themselves clever but weak, inventive but fragile, useful for certain tasks but ultimately insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And Crixthanar expected them to behave accordingly when faced with the might of the Imperium. He expected groveling and immediate confessions, and perhaps some weeping, because that was what lesser species did when dragons came calling with fire in their eyes and death in their claws. The human orbital station was a spinning ring of metal and glass that looked almost delicate compared to dragon architecture, and Crixthanar felt a moment of contempt as his shuttle approached it, because everything about humanity seemed so temporary, so easily broken. Director Chun met him in a conference room that smelled of something strange and bitter, and she was a small woman with gray hair and calm eyes, and she offered him tea, as if he were a visiting friend rather than an angry representative of the most powerful empire in the galaxy. Crixthanar did not want tea, and he did not want pleasantries, and he made this very clear by allowing smoke to curl from his nostrils, and by letting his claws scrape against the metal floor, and by speaking in a voice that had made planetary governors tremble. "Your kind has stolen 17 hatchlings from the sacred grounds of Pirith," he said, "and you will return them immediately, or I will reduce this station to dust, and then I will do the same to every human colony until there is nothing left of your species but ash and memory." Director Chun took a sip of her tea, and she did not tremble, and she did not weep, and she did not grovel, and instead, she simply smiled in a way that Crixthanar found deeply irritating. "Ambassador," she said, "we did not take your hatchlings, but we know who did, and we know where they are being held, and we know how to get them back." This was not the response Krixnar had expected, and for a moment he was unsure how to proceed because threats only worked on those who were afraid, and this small human woman did not seem afraid at all. "Explain." He demanded. Director Chen set down her tea and activated a holographic display that showed a region of space filled with swirling gases and dangerous radiation, a place the dragons knew well because it was the territory of the Hollow Syndicate, the most dangerous criminal organization in the galaxy. "The Syndicate took your hatchlings," Director Chun said, "probably to sell them to the highest bidder because there are collectors out there who would pay fortunes beyond imagination for dragon young. And they are hiding in the Varith Nebula where your sensors cannot reach and your dreadnoughts cannot follow." Krixnar studied the display and felt his anger turn cold and sharp because he knew she was right. The Varith Nebula was a graveyard of ships that had tried to navigate its storms, and even dragon technology could not pierce its interference. "If what you say is true," he said slowly, "then how do you propose to retrieve them?" Director Chun smiled again, and this time there was something in her eyes that Krixnar had not seen before. Something old and patient and surprisingly fierce. "We go in together," she said. "Your strength and our cunning, your fire and our shadows, because Ambassador, the Syndicate expects you to come roaring in with your fleet. And they are prepared for that, but they are not prepared for us, and they are certainly not prepared for what happens when humans and dragons work together." Krixnar wanted to refuse because the idea of needing human help was insulting to everything he believed, but the faces of 17 missing hatchlings floated in his mind, and he knew that pride was a luxury he could not afford. "Tell me more," he said, and for the first time since arriving, he sat down and listened. The human vessel was called the Whisper, and Krixnar hated it from the moment. He stepped aboard because it was small and cramped, and it smelled of recycled air and human sweat, and worst of all, it made him feel like a giant trying to fit inside. A child's toy dragon ships were built for comfort and intimidation, with wide corridors and high ceilings and everything designed to remind visitors that they were in the presence of greatness, but this ship was built for something else entirely. For hiding and sneaking and moving through spaces where no one wanted to be found. Sergeant Okonkwo was the leader of the human strike team, and she was a tall woman with dark skin and eyes that seemed to see everything at once, and she greeted Krixnar with a brief nod that held neither fear nor excessive respect. "Ambassador," she said, "we have limited space, so you will need to share quarters with my team, and I apologize in advance if our accommodations are not what you are used to." Krixnar had slept on battlefields and in the ruins of conquered cities, and he did not need luxury, but he found himself bothered by how casually this human treated him, as if he were just another soldier rather than a representative of an empire that could destroy her entire species. "I will manage," he said stiffly. The journey to the Varith Nebula would take 4 days, and during that time Krixnar watched the humans prepare for their mission, and what he saw confused him more with each passing hour. Dragon warriors prepared for battle by sharpening claws and testing flame and roaring challenges to ancestors and enemies alike, but these humans did none of those things. Instead, they checked their equipment in silence and ran through hand signals that Krixnar did not understand, and cleaned their weapons with the same care a mother might use when tending to a sick child. They did not boast about their kills, or compare scars, or speak of glory and honor, and this bothered Krixnar because he could not understand warriors who did not celebrate their own strength. On the second day, he approached Sergeant Okonkwo while she was reviewing maps of the Syndicate base, and he asked her the question that had been burning in his mind since they departed. "Why do your soldiers not prepare their spirits for battle?" he asked. "Where's the fire in their hearts?" Okonkwo looked at him for a long moment, and then she gestured for him to sit beside her. And when he did, she spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried the weight of experience. "Ambassador," she said, My people have been fighting wars since before we had metal tools. We have killed each other over land and resources and gods and ideas. And in all that time, we learned something important. What did you learn? Crixthar asked. We learned that the warriors who survive are not always the strongest or the bravest. Okonkwo said, they are the ones who stay calm when everything goes wrong. The ones who can think clearly when their friends are dying around them. The ones who save their fire for when it matters most. She pulled up an image on her display, showing the Syndicate base carved into an asteroid and surrounded by defenses that would tear apart any frontal assault. Your dreadnoughts could destroy this base in minutes. She continued, but the hatchlings would die before your weapons even fired because the Syndicate knows you are coming, and they have prepared for exactly the kind of attack dragons always use. Crixthar felt his scales flush with anger because she was right, and he hated that she was right. So, what do you propose? He asked. Okonkwo smiled, and it was not a kind smile but rather the smile of a predator that had spotted prey. We do not attack at all, she said. We slip inside like water through cracks in stone, and we find the hatchlings and we bring them out before anyone knows we were there. And if we are discovered, then we adapt. Okonkwo said simply, that is what humans do. Over the next 2 days, Crixthar trained with the human team, and he learned things that no dragon had ever been taught. He learned how to move silently, despite his size, and how to communicate without making a sound, and how to control his breathing, so that even his flames stayed hidden. He learned that humans were not weak at all, but rather strong in ways that dragons had never considered, because human strength was not about muscles or claws or fire. It was about refusing to quit, even when everything seemed impossible. Private tourists showed him how humans could slow their heartbeats during times of stress, and Crixthar realized that what he had mistaken for weakness was actually incredible. Control Corporal Singh explained how human eyes could adapt to darkness better than almost any species in the galaxy, and Crixthar understood why humans had evolved as ambush predators on their home world. Specialist Park demonstrated how humans could survive injuries that would kill most other creatures and keep fighting through pain that would drive a dragon mad. And Crixthar felt something he had not expected to feel toward these small, soft creatures. He felt respect on the final night. Before they reached the nebula, Sergeant Okonkwo found him staring out a viewport at the stars, and she stood beside him in comfortable silence until he spoke. I have been a warrior for 2,000 years, he said, and I believed I understood what strength meant, but your people have shown me that I was only seeing part of the truth. Okonkwo nodded slowly, and her voice was gentle when she replied, the galaxy is vast, Ambassador, and there are many kinds of strength. Dragons have fire and power and long lives, but humans have something else. We have the ability to change and adapt and become whatever we need to be to survive. She turned to face him directly, and her eyes held no fear, only determination. Tomorrow, we go into that base, and we will face enemies who want to kill us and obstacles. We cannot predict, and things will go wrong, because they always do. But I promise you this, Ambassador. We will not stop until those hatchlings are safe, even if it costs us everything. Crixthar looked at this human who was so small compared to him, and who lived such a brief life compared to dragons, and he saw something that reminded him of the warriors he had admired most in his long existence. Not the ones who sought glory, but the ones who simply did what needed to be done regardless of the cost. I believe you, he said, and he meant it. The whisper entered the Verith Nebula at dawn, and the storm swallowed them whole, and Crixthar felt real fear for the first time in centuries. But Okonkwo just smiled, and her team moved with perfect calm, and together they sailed into darkness. The Verith Nebula was a graveyard of ships and dreams, and the whisper navigated through it like a fish swimming through a hurricane, while Crixthar gripped his seat and tried not to think about how many vessels had died in these storms. Human Navigation systems were primitive compared to dragon technology, but they worked in ways that dragon systems could not, because they were not trying to see through the interference. Instead, they were reading the patterns of the storm itself and moving with them rather than against them. Sergeant Okonkwo had explained it simply when Crixthar asked how they would find their way through the chaos. On our homeworld, we have oceans, she had said, and in those oceans we have currents and storms, and our ancestors learned to sail them thousands of years ago, not by fighting the water, but by understanding it and becoming part of it. It seemed like madness to Crixthar, but the whisper slipped through the nebula without a scratch, and 3 hours after entering the storm, they emerged in a pocket of calm space where an asteroid hung like a dark jewel against the swirling gases. The Syndicate base was carved into that asteroid, and even from a distance, Crixthar could see the weapons platforms and patrol ships and sensor arrays that protected it. Defenses that would have detected a dragon vessel the moment it entered the nebula, but had not noticed the whisper at all. How do we get inside? Crixthar whispered. Loading bay on the south side, Okonkwo replied quietly. They bring in supplies every 6 hours, and the security checks are routine, which means sloppy. We attach to the next cargo ship and ride in with the groceries. It was undignified, and Crixthar hated every moment of it, but it worked, and soon they were inside the asteroid, moving through maintenance tunnels that smelled of rust and old grease. While Okonkwo led the way with silent hand signals that her team followed without hesitation, the plan was simple, because Okonkwo believed that simple plans survived contact with the enemy, while complicated ones fell apart at the worst possible moment. They would reach the holding cells where the hatchlings were kept, and they would disable the guards, and they would extract the young dragons and escape before anyone raised an alarm. The plan lasted approximately 12 minutes before everything went wrong. Day patrol appeared around a corner that was supposed to be empty, and Specialist Park was the first to react, moving so fast that Crixthar barely saw her before 2 guards were on the ground, unconscious, but one had managed to hit an alarm before falling, and suddenly the entire base knew they were Crixthar, prepared to fight, because that was what dragons did when cornered. But Okonkwo grabbed his arm and pulled him down a different corridor. No time, she said. We adapt. They ran through tunnels that twisted and turned, and Okonkwo changed their route 3 times based on sounds that Crixthar could barely hear, and twice they hid in shadows while patrols rushed past, and once they dropped down a shaft that seemed to go on forever before landing in a storage room filled with crates of stolen goods. The chaos of the alarm actually helped them, because the Syndicate guards were looking for a frontal assault force, not a small team hiding in their own supply closets, and Okonkwo used their confusion against them, moving when they moved and hiding when they searched. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, they reached the holding cells, and Crixthar prepared himself for whatever he might find, because he had seen what criminal organizations did to valuable hostages, and he feared that the hatchlings might be damaged beyond healing. But when Okonkwo sliced through the lock and the door swung open, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks and made his ancient heart stutter with shock. The room was dark, and it was filled with bodies, but the bodies were not hatchlings. They were Syndicate guards, at least 8 of them scattered across the floor with wounds from claws and teeth and fire. And standing in the middle of the room were 17 young dragons, barely past their first molt. They were covered in burns and cuts, and their scales were dull from stress and lack of proper food, but they were alive. And they were standing in a defensive circle around something that Crixthar could not immediately see. It is safe now, he said in the ancient dragon tongue. I am Ambassador Crixthar of the High Clutch, and I have come to take you home. The hatchlings did not immediately relax, and the largest of them, a young female whose scales were the color of sunset, stepped forward with suspicion in her eyes. How do we know you are truly from the Imperium? She demanded. The Syndicate tried to trick us before. Crixthar felt a surge of pride because these children had survived and fought and remained wary, even when rescue seemed at hand, and that was exactly the kind of spirit that would serve them well in the centuries ahead. He spoke the ancient words that only members of the High Clutch knew, phrases that had been passed down for 10,000 years and could not be faked. And when he finished, the hatchlings finally relaxed, the circle parted, and Krixtnar saw what they had been protecting. A human child, a boy perhaps 10 years old, with brown skin and frightened eyes and clothes that were torn and dirty from weeks of captivity. Krixtnar stared at the boy and then at the hatchlings and then back at the boy again, because this made no sense at all. Dragon hatchlings were natural predators who could kill a human child without effort, so why had they been protecting him? The sunset-scaled female spoke as if reading his confusion. "His name is Marcus," she said. "He was already here when they brought. Used to this place, and he was supposed to be sold to someone who collects exotic pets, but instead he helped us. He taught us how to fight without using flames so the guards would not hear, and he showed us which shadows to hide in, and he gave us his food even when he was hungry himself." Krixtnar looked at the human boy, who met his gaze with more courage than most adults of any species would have shown. They were scared. Marcus said simply, as if that explained everything, "And nobody should be alone when they are scared." Sergeant Okonkwo moved forward and knelt beside the boy, and her voice was gentle in a way Krixtnar had not heard from her before. "Hey there, Marcus," she said. "We are going to get you out of here. Okay, we are going to take you home." Marcus nodded, but he did not move away from the hatchlings, and the hatchlings did not move away from him, because somehow in this dark place, these children of different species had become a family. Krixtnar felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been frozen for a very long time, because he had lived for 2,000 years and conquered worlds and commanded fleets, but he had never seen anything quite as extraordinary as a human child teaching dragons how to hope. "Can you all walk?" Okonkwo asked the group. The hatchlings nodded, and Marcus stood up straight, even though Krixtnar could see that he was exhausted and probably injured. "Good," Okonkwo said, "because we have a long way to go, and it is going to get dangerous, but I need everyone to stay calm and stay together and do exactly what I say." "Can you do that?" 17 dragon hatchlings and 1 human boy all nodded as one, and Krixtnar realized that he was witnessing something that would change the galaxy forever, even if he did not yet understand how they moved out into the corridors and the real escape began. The escape from the Syndicate base should have been impossible because every corridor was filled with guards and every exit was blocked, and somewhere in the command center, the warlord himself was directing the hunt for the intruders who had dared to enter his domain. Krixtnar had fought in wars that lasted centuries, but he had never experienced anything quite like following Sergeant Okonkwo through that maze of metal and danger while trying to protect 17 hatchlings and 1 human. Boy Okonkwo moved like smoke, appearing and disappearing through shadows that Krixtnar had not even noticed, and her team flowed around her in perfect coordination without speaking a single word because they had trained together so long that they could read each other's movements like a language. Twice they encountered patrols that should have spotted them, but the humans reacted before Krixtnar even understood what was happening. Guards went down silently, and bodies were hidden in maintenance closets, and the group kept moving as if nothing had interrupted their journey. The hatchlings followed with surprising discipline, and Krixtnar realized that Marcus had taught them well during their weeks of captivity. They moved quietly and stayed low and controlled their breathing so that not even a wisp of smoke escaped their nostrils. Marcus himself stayed in the center of the group, surrounded by dragon children who watched over him with protective intensity. And Krixtnar found himself doing the same because this small human had earned something that dragons rarely gave to outsiders. He had earned their loyalty. They reached the loading bay, where the Whisper was hidden among cargo containers, and for A brief moment, Krixthanar allowed himself to believe that they might actually escape without further incident. But that hope died when alarms began screaming and blast doors started closing, and a voice echoed through the base. "This is Warlord Ketch," the voice said. "I know you are in loading Bay 7, and I want you to know that my cruiser is currently moving into position outside the only exit from this asteroid. Surrender now, and I will make your deaths quick. Resist, and I will make them last for years." Krixthanar looked at Okonkwo and saw no fear in her eyes, only calculation, as she processed this new information and adjusted her plans. "Everyone on to the Whisper," she ordered. "Private Torres, get us ready for immediate departure. Corporal Singh, prepare the countermeasures. Ambassador, I need you to keep the hatchlings calm because things are about to get interesting." They boarded the ship in seconds, and Torres had the engines running before the last person cleared the airlock, and Krixthanar found himself herding dragon children into a cargo bay that was far too small while trying to project the confidence. He did not feel the Whisper launched through the loading bay doors just as Syndicate fighters began pouring in from the opposite direction, and Krixthanar caught a glimpse of the Warlord's cruiser through a viewport. A massive vessel bristling with weapons that could destroy them 100 times over. "We are outgunned," Krixthanar said, because it seemed important to state the obvious. Okonkwo smiled, and it was that Predator's smile again, the one that made Krixthanar nervous even though it was not directed at him. "Ambassador," she said, "I need to tell you something that Director Chun asked me to keep secret until the right moment." "What?" "The Whisper is not alone." She pressed a button on her console, and suddenly the darkness around them came alive with ships, 12 human vessels that had been hiding in the nebula since before the Whisper ever arrived. 12 sets of weapons that now locked onto the Warlord's cruiser with deadly precision. But Krixthanar knew that even 12 small human ships could not defeat a Syndicate cruiser in direct combat, so he waited because he sensed that Okonkwo was not finished. Director Chen spent the last 6 months gathering intelligence on the Hollow Syndicate, Okonkwo explained as the Whisper wove between enemy fighters. She found everything, every safe house, every bribed official, every hidden bank account, every secret that the Syndicate has killed to protect. She pressed another button, and Krixthanar saw something appear on every screen in the sector. A broadcast that was being sent to every ship and every station and every government in the Galactic Armament was a file containing thousands of documents and recordings and financial records that detailed every crime the Syndicate had committed for the past century. Names of accomplices and locations of bases and evidence that would destroy reputations and end careers and send powerful beings to prison for the rest of their lives. The effect was immediate and devastating. The Syndicate fighters stopped pursuing the Whisper because their pilots were suddenly more concerned with what this information meant for their own futures. The cruiser's weapons went silent as officers realized that their names were in those files and that continuing to follow the Warlord's orders would only make things worse. And across the galaxy, thousands of beings who had worked with the Syndicate or taken their bribes or looked the other way began to panic because their secrets were no longer secret, and the only way to save themselves was to turn on the organization that had once protected them. Warlord Ketch's voice came over the comm one final time, and it was no longer confident, but rather shaking with barely controlled rage. "You think information will save you?" he snarled. "I will hunt you across the galaxy. I will burn your worlds and salt your fields and make your children pay for this insult." Director Chen's voice cut through his threats, calm and almost amused. "Warlord Ketch," she said, "in the time it took you to make that threat, I have received 17 offers from your own lieutenants to deliver you to WISE authorities in exchange for immunity. Your empire is already crumbling, and you do not even know which of your own crew members are planning to betray you." The comm went silent, and through the viewport Krixthanar saw the cruiser's running lights flicker as something happened inside it. A mutiny perhaps, or maybe just officers deciding that their loyalty to the warlord was not worth dying for. Whispers slipped past the disabled cruiser and into the safety of the nebula, and behind them the hollow syndicate began to tear itself apart as former allies became enemies and secrets became weapons. Crix Ether sat in the cargo bay, surrounded by sleeping hatchlings and one exhausted human boy, and he tried to process what he had just witnessed. Dragons fought with fire and claws, an overwhelming force, because that was how wars had always been won. But humans had just destroyed one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the galaxy without firing a single shot. They had used information like a blade and turned the enemy's own secrets against them, and Crix there realized that he had completely misunderstood what kind of threat humanity truly represented. They were not weak at all. They were simply fighting a different kind of war. Kunkel appeared in the doorway of the cargo bay, and she looked tired but satisfied. "We will be clear of the nebula in a few hours," she said. "Director Chan has arranged for a dragon escort to meet us at the edge of the system." Crixton nodded, but he could not stop thinking about what he had seen. How long did Director Chan plan this operation? He asked, and Kunkel shrugged, as if bringing down a criminal empire was just another day at work. "About 6 months for the intelligence gathering," she said. "But humans have been learning to use information as a weapon for thousands of years. It is kind of our specialty." She left him alone with the sleeping children, and Crixthanar stayed awake through the night, watching over them and thinking about what the future might hold now that dragons and humans had found a reason to work together. The fortress world of Pirith had never seen anything like the celebration that greeted the return of the 17 hatchlings, and the streets were filled with dragons of every age and color, singing ancient songs of victory while flames painted the sky in ribbons of gold and crimson. Crixithner walked through crowds that parted for him with respect and gratitude, because word had spread of what he had accomplished, even though he knew that the true credit belonged to the humans who had made the rescue possible. The hatchlings were taken to the medical halls, where healers tended to their wounds and pronounced them healthy despite their ordeal, and their families wept with joy and relief at having their children returned. But there was one more matter to be settled, and Crixthanar found himself standing before the High Clutch in the great throne room, where the leaders of the Draconis Imperium made decisions that shaped the galaxy. High Matriarch Silvera sat upon a throne of volcanic glass, and her scales were the deep purple of royalty, and her eyes held the wisdom of 5,000 years, as she regarded Crixthanar with an expression that was impossible to read. "Ambassador," she said, "you have returned our children to us, and the Imperium is grateful. But we are told that you did not accomplish this alone. We are told that humans played a role in the rescue." "More than a role," Crixthanar said, because he had decided during the journey home that he would not diminish what the humans had done. The rescue would have been impossible without them. Their technology guided us through the nebula. Their soldiers led us through the enemy base, and their intelligence brought down the syndicate. The High Clutch murmured at this, because it was strange to hear a dragon elder praise humans so openly. "And what of the human child?" Silvera asked. "The one called Marcus, who protected our hatchlings during their captivity." "He waits below," Crixthanar said. "The hatchlings refused to be separated from him until they were certain he would not be harmed." Silvera made a gesture, and guards brought Marcus into the throne room, and he looked so small surrounded by dragons that Crixthanar felt a strange protective urge that surprised him. Boy stood straight and met the High Matriarch's gaze without flinching, and Crixthanar felt pride in him even though they had known each other for only a few days. "Marcus of Earth," Silvera said, "you protected the children of our empire when you had no obligation to do so, and you shared your food with them when you were hungry, and you taught them to survive when you could barely survive yourself. Why did you do these things?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice was clear, because they were scared. He said, And because they were just kids like me, and nobody deserves to be alone when they are scared. It did not matter that they were dragons, and I was human, because fear is fear and alone is alone, and helping is just what you are supposed to do. The throne room fell silent, and Crixthanar saw something remarkable happen. The High Matriarch's expression softened in a way that he had never seen before. The Imperium offers you a gift, Silvera said. Citizenship in our empire with all the rights and privileges that entails. You would be the first human to ever receive such an honor. You could live here in wealth and comfort for the rest of your days. Marcus looked at the floor for a moment, and then back at the High Matriarch. Thank you, he said. But I want to go home. My mom is probably really worried about me, and I miss my little sister. There was no greed in his eyes and no calculation, and Crixthanar realized that this child had never thought about rewards when he helped the hatchlings. He had simply done what needed to be done. Then we will return you to your family with honors, Silvera said, and the Draconis Imperium will consider Earth and its people friends from this day forward. But there was one more matter, and it came from an unexpected source. The hatchlings had been brought to the throne room to receive blessings from the High Clutch. But instead of standing quietly in their places, they moved forward as a group with the sunset-scale female at their head. High Matriarch, she said with more confidence than any hatchling had ever shown before the throne. We have a request. Silvera raised an eye ridge at this breach of protocol, but she did not stop the young dragon from speaking. We wish to have a human teacher. The hatchling continued. Not for combat or science, because the Imperium has masters in those things, but for what Marcus taught us. He showed us how to protect those weaker than ourselves, and how to keep hoping when everything seemed lost, and how to turn fear into something useful. She looked at Crixthanar, and then at the human delegates who had been allowed to attend the ceremony. Dragons have ruled the galaxy because we are strong, she said. But Marcus is strong in a different way, and we want to learn what he knows. The High Clutch debated for hours, but in the end they agreed, because how could they refuse the children who had survived such an ordeal? And Crixthanar was asked to deliver his official report in private to the matriarch herself. He spoke for a long time about everything he had seen and everything he had learned, and when he finished, Silver was quiet for many minutes before responding. You believe the humans are more than they appear, she said. I believe they are perhaps the most dangerous species we have ever encountered. Crixthanar replied, not because they have fire or claws or great warships, but because they simply refuse to stop. They adapt and endure and survive things that would destroy any other race, and they do it without even seeming to realize how extraordinary they are. He paused and remembered Marcus, standing over wounded dragon hatchlings in a dark room surrounded by the bodies of enemies he had helped them defeat. In 10,000 years of conquest, we have never faced anything like them. He continued, they are not predators or prey. They are survivors. And I am beginning to think that is something far more powerful than either. Silvera considered his words, and her ancient eye saw things that Crixthanar could only guess at. Then, perhaps it is time for the Imperium to stop thinking of humans as lesser beings, she said, and start thinking of them as allies. 50 years passed, and the galaxy changed in ways that no one had predicted. Marcus grew up to become an ambassador like Crixthanar, and he worked tirelessly to build bridges between species that had never spoken before. And the hatchlings he had protected grew into leaders who remembered what a scared human boy had taught them in a dark room when the threat came from beyond the galactic edge, a force that had destroyed civilizations older than the Imperium. Dragons and humans stood together for the first time in history. Dragon Admiral Vyrath Crix, who had once been a sunset-scaled hatchling in a syndicate holding cell, commanded the combined fleet, and at her side stood Ambassador Marcus Chen, older now, but still carrying that same quiet courage that had made him stay with frightened children when he could have tried to save only himself. The enemy was vast and terrible, and it had never known defeat, but it had never faced humans and dragons working together either. The dragons brought fire and the humans brought something older. The same stubborn refusal to quit that had kept their species alive through ice ages and plagues and wars that should have ended them. It was not an easy victory, and it was not a quick one, but in the end, the darkness was pushed back and they, Galaxy Surveyed Krikshnar, lived long enough to see it. All beyond counting, but still sharp enough to appreciate what had grown from that rescue mission so many years ago. He wrote one final entry in his personal log before he died. Words that would be taught to dragon hatchlings for generations. Humanity is too stubborn to know when to quit. He wrote, and thanked the stars for that, because when the universe tried to break them, they just got back up and kept fighting, and when they saw others in need, they helped without asking what was in it for them. I have lived for millennia, and I have seen empires rise and fall, but I have never seen anything quite like these strange soft creatures who conquered the darkness, not with strength, but with an absolute refusal to give up. They taught us that there is more to power than fire, and more to courage than not being afraid, and more to victory than defeating your enemies. They taught us that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is help someone who is scared and alone. I am honored to have known them, and I'm glad they are our friends. And across the galaxy, humans and dragons work together to build something new. Something that neither species could have created alone. And the hatchlings of both races grew up learning that the universe was vast and dangerous, but it was also full of allies. If you knew where to look all, because one small human boy decided that scared children deserved kindness, no matter what species they happened to be.